Your current balance is $0.00. That was the last thing Colette heard before her world collapsed. 8 months pregnant, standing in a grocery store parking lot. Card declined. Every account emptied. Every dollar gone. Her husband, Grant, didn't just leave her. He planned it. For 18 months, he moved their money into hidden accounts. He forged her signature on their mortgage. He bought his mistress a luxury penthouse using his pregnant wife's money. And then he posted a champagne toast on Instagram with one word, "New chapter." He celebrated while she sat on the kitchen floor with divorce papers in her lap and nothing in the bank. But Grant made one mistake. One fatal, irreversible mistake. He never asked about her father, and when the judge looked at him in that courtroom and asked 5 simple words, "Who is her father?" the smirk disappeared from Grant's face. The color drained from his skin, and everything he had built on cruelty and calculation came crashing down around him. Because the woman he left penniless was the daughter of a billionaire, and she had been hiding it the entire time. This is the story of a woman who wanted to be loved for who she was, and a man who destroyed himself because he never bothered to find out. The lesson of the story is simple but powerful. The people who truly love you will never need you to be less than you are. Your worth is not determined by the person who failed to see it. It is determined by the moment you finally see it yourself. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of your own strength or the strength of someone you love, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true worth? Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Every story we tell is about courage, justice, and the power of knowing who you really are. Your current balance is $0.00. Colette stood in the kitchen of their Boston townhouse, phone pressed against her ear, one hand resting on her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant. The grocery bags sat on the counter, unpaid for. Her debit card had been declined at the register. Not insufficient funds, declined. She had smiled at the cashier. Sorry, must be a glitch. But her hands were already shaking when she walked back to the car. Now the automated banking system repeated itself. Checking account, 0. Savings account, 0. Joint investment fund, 0. She ended the call, dialed Grant. It rang 4 times, 5, 6, voicemail. She called again, voicemail. The 3rd time he picked up. "Grant, the accounts are empty," she said. "All of them." A pause stretched between them. She could hear noise in the background. Music. People talking. Wherever he was, it was not quiet. "I know," he said, 2 words, flat, cold, like he was confirming a weather forecast. Colette lowered herself into a kitchen chair. The baby kicked hard against her ribs. Once, twice, as if the child could feel what was coming before she could. "What do you mean, you know?" she asked. "I'm restructuring our finances," Grant said. His voice had that tone she had heard him use on the phone with difficult clients. Professional, detached. "You'll understand soon." "Grant, I couldn't buy groceries. I'm 8 months pregnant and I couldn't buy milk. I have to go," he said. "We'll talk later." The line went dead. Colette stared at the phone screen. His name disappeared. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, an October wind pushed dry leaves across the porch. She stood up, walked to the refrigerator, opened it, stared at the shelves, closed it, opened it again, as if the second time might show her something different, as if the world might rearrange itself behind a closed door. It didn't. She grabbed her keys and drove to Grant's office. The law firm occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in the financial district. She knew every security guard by name. She had brought cookies at Christmas. She had attended every firm dinner with a smile and the right dress and conversation that made Grant look good. His assistant, Paige, looked up when Colette stepped off the elevator. Paige's face changed instantly. Something flickered behind her eyes. Recognition. Not of Colette, of a situation. He left early, Paige said. She couldn't meet Colette's gaze. About an hour ago. Where did he go? Paige hesitated. She pressed her lips together. Then quietly she said, he left with Delaney. Delaney Voss. The junior partner with the sharp cheekbones and the sharper eyes. The one who always stood a little too close to Grant at company parties. The one who laughed a little too hard at his jokes. The one Colette had noticed and then told herself she was imagining things. Thank you, Paige, Colette said. Her voice was steady. She didn't know how. She drove home. The October sun was setting, turning the sky copper and gold. Beautiful. She didn't see it. A manila envelope sat on the front doorstep. She picked it up, sat down on the porch steps, opened it. Divorce papers, filed that morning at 9:15, while she had been at her prenatal appointment, while the doctor had measured her belly and said, baby is healthy, mom is healthy, everything looks perfect, while she had texted Grant a photo of the ultrasound with a heart emoji, while she had been living in a marriage that was already dead. A post-it note was stuck to the first page, Grant's handwriting. Sharp, slanted letters she used to find charming. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Colette sat on the steps, the envelope in her lap, the October wind pulling at her hair. 8 months pregnant. No money, no warning. The baby kicked again, softer this time, almost gentle. She didn't cry, not yet. There would be time for that later. Instead, she watched a squirrel cross the yard. It stopped near the garden bed she had planted last spring, dug a small hole, buried an acorn, methodical, purposeful, preparing for the winter it knew was coming. She thought, I should have been preparing too. Blythe called at 7:42 that evening. Colette was sitting on the kitchen floor. The divorce papers were spread around her in a half circle. She had read them 3 times. Each reading revealed another knife. He wanted the townhouse, the cars, the investment accounts, full ownership of everything they had built together. His filing claimed that Colette had contributed no significant financial resources to the marital estate. 6 years of marriage, reduced to a financial spreadsheet where her column was blank. Her phone buzzed. Blythe's name lit up the screen. Are you sitting down? Blythe asked. I'm on the floor, Colette said. So yes. Grant just posted an Instagram story. He's at Maison Noire. Maison Noire, the most exclusive restaurant in Boston. 3-month wait list, $400 a plate. They had gone there for their 5th anniversary. Grant had ordered the wine. Colette had worn the blue dress, he said, made her eyes look like the ocean. He's with Delaney, Blythe continued. Her voice was tight with controlled fury. Champagne toast. Caption says, New chapter. New chapter. He had posted it 45 minutes after she found the divorce papers on the doorstep. I'm coming over, Blythe said. It wasn't a question. 20 minutes later, Blythe stood in Colette's kitchen, coat still on, reading through the papers with the focused intensity of someone who analyzed financial documents for a living. Colette. Blythe set down the papers. He's claiming the townhouse is entirely his, the cars, the investment portfolio. He's saying you contributed nothing to the marriage. I gave up my career for him, Colette said quietly. I moved to Boston for him. I managed this house. I hosted his clients. I carried his child. Her inner voice was louder than her spoken words. I gave everything. Everything. And according to these papers, I am worth nothing. Blythe knelt beside her on the floor. We're going to fight this. With what money, Blythe? He took everything. Before Blythe could answer, Colette's phone rang. The screen showed a name that made her stomach tighten. Margot Mercer, Grant's mother. Colette answered. She didn't know why. Maybe habit. Maybe the desperate hope that her mother-in-law might show a shred of compassion. Colette. Margot's voice was crisp and practiced. I assume you've received the papers. I have. Then you know what the right thing to do is. Sign them, quietly. Preserve whatever little dignity you have left. Colette closed her eyes. Margot had never liked her. From the very first dinner, Margot had looked at Colette the way someone looks at a stain on an expensive tablecloth. Polite enough not to mention it directly, but aware of it, always aware. In Margot's eyes, Colette was the girl with no family connections, no money, no status. A charity case that Grant had inexplicably chosen over the daughters of Margot's country club friends. Thank you for your concern, Margot, Colette said. She hung up. Blythe was staring at her. I've been biting my tongue about that woman for 6 years. Colette almost smiled. Almost. After Blythe left, after the house went quiet, and the baby settled into stillness, Colette went to the bedroom. She opened her bedside drawer, pushed aside old receipts, a broken watch, a book of stamps. At the very bottom, beneath everything, there was a business card. She hadn't touched it in 6 years, embossed gold lettering on heavy cream stock. Ashford Industries. She turned it over. On the back, written in careful handwriting she would recognize anywhere. Whenever you're ready, sweetheart, Dad. Harrison Ashford, her father, the man whose name she had deliberately erased from her life when she married Grant Mercer, the man whose fortune she had hidden like a secret that could burn. When Colette met Grant, she made one deliberate, irreversible choice. She never told him about her father. She used her mother's maiden name. She wore clothes from department stores. She drove a used car. She let Grant believe she was exactly what she appeared to be, a girl from a modest background with no family to speak of. And Grant, who never asked questions he didn't think would benefit him, never looked deeper. Harrison Ashford, founder and chairman of Ashford Industries. Net worth, as of the most recent Forbes listing, $4.2 billion. $4.2 billion. And Colette had hidden it all because she wanted one simple, impossible thing. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not for what her father owned. She set the card back in the drawer. Not yet. She wasn't ready yet. She lay down on the bed, pulled the covers up to her chin. The sheets still smelled like Grant's cologne, sandalwood and cedar, a scent she had once found comforting. Now it made her sick. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of old wood, the tick of the hallway clock, the sound of her own breathing. I wasn't his wife, she thought. I was a stepping stone, and he just kicked me aside to climb higher. 3 days passed. Colette survived on what was left in the pantry: pasta, canned soup, a bag of rice. Blythe brought groceries and pretended it was because she had bought too much at Costco. Colette let her pretend. On the 4th day, Blythe arrived with her laptop and a look that Colette recognized. The look Blythe wore when she had found something and wished she hadn't. Sit down, Blythe said. You keep telling people to sit down, Colette replied. That's never followed by good news. Blythe opened her laptop. She had spent 3 days doing what she did best: following the money, pulling public records, tracing transactions. Grant didn't decide to leave you last week, Blythe said. This has been planned for at least 18 months. 18 months. Colette did the math. 18 months ago, she and Grant had just started trying for a baby. 18 months ago, he had brought her breakfast in bed on a Sunday morning and said, I think we're ready to be parents. He was planning to leave her while they were trying to conceive. Blythe laid out the evidence piece by piece. Over the past 18 months, Grant had systematically moved joint assets into accounts solely in his name. He had taken out a second mortgage on the townhouse using a forged signature. Colette's signature, a forgery. He had changed the beneficiary on his life insurance from Colette to Margot. And he had created a shell company, registered in Delaware, where he had been quietly funneling income. This wasn't a man who fell out of love. This was a man who planned a demolition. Colette sat at the kitchen table. She stared at the documents. The numbers blurred. Not because she was crying, but because her brain refused to process what she was seeing. He held my hand at the ultrasound, she thought. He held my hand and looked at the screen and said, "That's our baby." And he had already decided to leave. He painted the nursery sage green because she said it was calming. He spent an entire Saturday afternoon with a roller brush and painter's tape, and she brought him lemonade, and he kissed her forehead and said, "Our kid is going to love this room." He painted the nursery knowing he would leave. The memories came flooding in, unbidden and unwelcome. Their wedding day. The way he looked at her when she walked down the aisle. The honeymoon in Maine. The lobster dinner where they laughed so hard she spilled butter on her dress and he said, "You're the most beautiful disaster I've ever seen." The first Christmas in the townhouse. The tree that was too tall for the living room. The way he lifted her up so she could put the star on top. Were any of those moments real? Was he performing the whole time? 6 years of method acting, 6 years of a man pretending to love a woman while waiting for the right moment to gut her. She went to the nursery, pushed open the door, the sage green walls glowed softly in the afternoon light. The crib they had assembled together stood in the corner. She remembered him swearing at the instructions, unable to figure out the Allen wrench. She had laughed until her sides hurt. She walked to the wall, pressed her palm flat against it. The paint was smooth and cool beneath her fingers. She stood there, 4 minutes, maybe 5, just breathing, just touching the wall, just standing in the room her husband had built for a baby he never intended to raise. And then another revelation hit. Blythe had found one more thing. The thing that changed everything. Delaney Voss was not just Grant's affair partner. She was the daughter of Richard Voss, the managing senior partner of Grant's law firm, the man who controlled promotions, partnerships, and the future of every attorney in the building. Grant wasn't just leaving Colette for another woman. He was marrying into professional power. Delaney was the key to the corner office, the equity partnership, the name on the letterhead. Every move Grant had made in the last 18 months led to this. The divorce, the timing, the financial gutting. It was all calculated to arrive at Delaney with maximum gain and minimum cost. And there was more. "Colette," Blythe said carefully, "Delaney is pregnant. 7 weeks." The room tilted. Grant wasn't just leaving her, he was replacing her, a newer model, better connected, more useful. She sat down on the nursery floor, her back against the sage wall. I wasn't wrong about him, she thought. I was wrong about myself. I thought I was his partner. I was his placeholder. Sleep became a stranger. Colette lay awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. The baby pressed against her ribs. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it pushing against the windows, a low moan that sounded like the house was grieving. She reached for her phone, not to call anyone, to search. Signs your husband was planning to leave. Financial abuse in marriage. Can he legally empty joint accounts? Is forging a signature a felony? Tab after tab after tab. The blue light of the phone was the only light in the room. She read stories from other women, women who had been blindsided, women who had trusted, women who had woken up one morning to find that the life they thought was solid was built on sand. She read for an hour, 2 hours. The phone grew warm in her hands. The baby shifted and settled. The house ticked and sighed around her. At 3:15, she got up. She went to the kitchen, opened the cupboard where she kept the recipe box, her mother's recipe box. Oak wood, slightly warped, with a brass latch that stuck. Her mother had died when Colette was 9, cancer. The quiet kind that moves fast and leaves a hole shaped exactly like a person. Harrison had been destroyed by it. He poured himself into work, into the company, into the empire that eventually made him a billionaire. He loved Colette fiercely, but he loved her from behind a wall of grief he never learned to take down. Colette found the recipe card she was looking for. Buttermilk biscuit. Her mother's handwriting, faded blue ink on a yellowed index card, stained with butter, soft at the edges from years of handling. She made the biscuits, measured the flour, cut in the cold butter with a fork, added the buttermilk slowly, the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother had learned from her mother. The dough came together under her hands, soft and forgiving. She rolled it out, cut rounds with the mouth of a glass, placed them on the baking sheet, slid them into the oven. The kitchen filled with warmth, the smell of baking bread, of butter and salt and something that tasted like childhood. She didn't eat the biscuits, she just made them, because the measuring and the kneading and the waiting gave her hands something to do while her mind came apart. The oven timer chimed at 3:52. She took out the biscuits, perfect golden domes. She set them on a wire rack, sat down at the table, and finally she cried. Not delicate tears, not movie crying, the ugly kind. The kind that twists your face and makes your chest heave and snot runs down your lip, and you don't care because no one is watching and you can finally fall apart in peace. She cried for 20 minutes, until her throat was raw and her eyes swelled shut, and the biscuits went cold on the counter. Then she washed her face, blew her nose, drank a glass of water. The phone rang at 9 the next morning, a number she didn't recognize. She answered anyway. "Mrs. Mercer, this is Donovan Hale. I represent your husband in the matter of Mercer versus Mercer." His voice was smooth and professional, the kind of voice that sounded reasonable while delivering cruelty. "I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Mercer is requesting you vacate the marital residence within 30 days. 30 days. 30 days from now, she would be 9 months pregnant, days from delivery, and Grant wanted her out of the house she had made into a home. Mr. Mercer is being generous with the timeline," Hale added. Generous. Colette's hand tightened on the phone. She could feel something shifting inside her. Not anger yet, something that came before anger. The moment when disbelief hardens into clarity. "I understand," she said, and hung up. She stood in the kitchen. The biscuits still sat on the counter. The October sunlight fell in long golden rectangles across the floor. The baby turned inside her, a slow roll, like a ship adjusting course. She went to the bedroom, opened the bedside drawer, took out the business card, Ashford Industries. "Whenever you're ready, sweetheart." She was ready. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. It rang once, just once. "Colette?" Harrison's voice, deep and steady and carrying 6 years of patient waiting. "Daddy." Her voice broke on the word, cracked right down the middle, like a plate, dropped on stone. "I need help." Harrison was quiet for 3 seconds. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, in that silence, everything he wanted to say and everything he was choosing not to say. Then, simply, he said, "I'll be there by morning." Harrison Ashford arrived at 6:15 the next morning. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. No entourage, no security detail, no fanfare. Just a 64-year-old man in a charcoal wool coat, carrying a brown paper bag of bagels from the bakery on Newberry Street that Colette had loved as a child, and a folder, 3 inches thick. Colette opened the door and saw her father for the first time in 2 years. He looked older. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hair, once salt and pepper, had gone fully silver. His hands shook slightly when he held up the bag. "I brought sesame," he said, "and the everything kind. I couldn't remember which one you liked." "Both," she said. "I always liked both." He smiled. It was a careful smile. The smile of a man who had missed his daughter every single day and was terrified of showing it too much. They sat at the kitchen table. Harrison ate a bagel. He poured himself coffee from the pot Colette had made. He looked around the kitchen, at the curtains she had chosen, the tile backsplash she had installed herself from a YouTube tutorial, the jar of wooden spoons by the stove. "You made this place beautiful," he said. "He wants me out of it in 30 days, Colette replied. Harrison set down his coffee. He opened the folder. "My team has been working through the night," he said. His voice shifted. The father receded. The chairman emerged. "Here is what we know." He laid it out with the surgical precision of a man who had built an empire on knowing things before other people did. Grant Mercer had committed fraud, forgery, and systematic financial abuse. His attorney had filed asset disclosures with the court that contained fabricated numbers. The forged signature on the second mortgage was a Class D felony in Massachusetts. The shell company in Delaware was designed to hide income from both Colette and the IRS. The forged signature alone could put him in prison, Harrison said. He said it the way someone might note that it was going to rain. Factual, certain, calm. Colette stared at the documents. 18 months of deception, laid out in bank statements and corporate filings and notarized lies. Harrison reached across the table. His trembling hand covered hers. "I know why you kept me secret," he said. "You wanted to be chosen for who you are, not for what I have." Colette nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. "And now you know the answer," Harrison continued. His voice was gentle, but unflinching. "He didn't choose you at all. He chose what he thought you were, and when that stopped being useful, he threw it away." He squeezed her hand. "But that says everything about him, and nothing about you." She didn't cry. She was done crying. Something harder than tears had taken root. Harrison introduced Warren Pratt at 10 o'clock that morning. Warren arrived in a gray suit and a tie the color of dried blood. He was 45, lean, quiet, and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen the inside of every courtroom in Massachusetts, which it had. Warren was a former federal prosecutor. He had spent 12 years putting white-collar criminals in prison before going into private practice. Harrison had kept him on retainer for a decade, not because he needed him often, but because when he did need him, he needed the best. Warren sat at the kitchen table. He did not eat a bagel. He opened his briefcase and removed a legal pad and a black pen. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "I've reviewed your husband's filings, his financial disclosures, his corporate records, and the second mortgage document bearing what appears to be your forged signature." "It is forged," Colette said. "I never signed that document." "I know," Warren said. "Our handwriting expert confirmed it last night." He outlined the counterattack. His pen moved across the legal pad in clean, precise strokes. Emergency motion to freeze all of Grant's accounts. Criminal referral to the district attorney for the forged signature. Full forensic accounting of the shell company. Petition for exclusive use of the marital home during the pregnancy and postpartum period, and a claim for full custody based on documented financial abuse and fraud. There's one more thing, Warren said. He said it almost casually, the way a surgeon might mention, just before closing, that they had found something unexpected. The prenuptial agreement. Colette had almost forgotten the prenup. Grant had insisted on it before the wedding. He had presented it as standard practice, a formality, nothing personal. At the time, Colette had thought it was because Grant had more assets than she did. He was a rising attorney. She was, as far as he knew, a girl with a modest savings account and a used car. The irony was stunning. The prenup contains an infidelity clause, Warren said. Section 12, paragraph 4. In the event of proven infidelity by either party, the agreement is voided in its entirety. Colette blinked. Voided? Completely. Not modified, not adjusted. Voided, as if it never existed, which means all marital assets are subject to equitable distribution under Massachusetts law. Grant had insisted on the prenup to protect himself. He had demanded it as a condition of the marriage. He had made Colette sign it, while assuring her it would never matter. It was about to matter more than anything he had ever signed. Colette almost laughed. She didn't, but she came close. That evening, Blythe texted her a video. 9 seconds long, Grant at a charity gala, black tie, champagne in hand. Surrounded by colleagues. Delaney beside him, in a red dress, her hand on his arm. Blythe had been at the gala too. She hadn't made a scene. She had done something better. She had recorded. In the video, Grant was talking to a group of laughing colleagues. His voice was clear, confident, cruel. She actually thought I was going to stay with a woman whose biggest ambition was throw pillows. I mean, come on. The woman's idea of a career was picking out curtains. The group laughed. Delaney smiled. Colette watched the video twice. The first time, something inside her crumbled. The second time, something inside her caught fire. I am done being the woman who takes it quietly. Warren filed the emergency motions on a Tuesday. By Friday, Grant's accounts were frozen. The phone call came at 8:17 on Saturday morning. Colette was in the nursery, folding baby clothes. Ruthie was downstairs making oatmeal. Harrison had returned to New York, but called every morning at 7 sharp. Grant's name appeared on her phone screen. She answered. What did you do? His voice was different. The smooth confidence was gone. In its place, something raw and panicked. Where did you get a lawyer? My accounts are frozen. All of them. I can't access anything. Colette folded a small yellow onesie, creased it along the seams, set it in the drawer. Colette, answer me. She let the silence stretch. 3 seconds. 5. 7. Then she said, You should have read the prenup more carefully, Grant. She hung up. Ruthie appeared in the nursery doorway. 58 years old, broad shoulders, kind eyes. She had been Harrison's housekeeper since before Colette was born. After Colette's mother died, Ruthie had become everything else. The one who made lunches, the one who sat in the front row at school plays, the one who knew that Colette liked her grilled cheese with the crusts cut diagonal, not straight. Ruthie had arrived 3 days earlier with 3 suitcases and a pot of chicken soup. Your father sent me, she had said, but I would have come anyway. She didn't ask questions. She cooked. She folded laundry. She hummed old songs while Colette tried to sleep. She was a presence, solid and warm and completely unshakable. Was that him? Ruthie asked from the doorway. It was. Good, Ruthie said. Let him choke on it. Oatmeal is ready. Grant's next move was predictable. He hired a private investigator to find out who was funding Colette's legal defense. The PI hit walls everywhere. Harrison's people were better. They had been building walls for decades. 3 days after the accounts were frozen, Margot Mercer appeared at Colette's front door, unannounced, uninvited. Her Cadillac idled in the driveway. Colette opened the door. Margot stood on the porch in a camel coat and pearl earrings. Her face was arranged in an expression that attempted fury, but landed closer to constipation. "You ungrateful little nobody," Margot said. "My son gave you everything. A home, a name, a life you never could have had on your own. And this is how you repay him?" Colette stood in the doorway, 8.5 months pregnant, barefoot, hair in a braid. She looked at her mother-in-law and felt something she hadn't expected. Nothing. No anger, no hurt, no desire to explain or defend or justify. Just a vast, clean nothing. "Your son gave me debt, Margot. Lies, a forged signature, and an empty bank account. But thank you for stopping by." She closed the door, locked it, walked back to the kitchen, sat down at the table. Ruthie slid a cup of tea across to her without a word. That night, Colette took a bath. Not a crisis bath, not a desperate, sit in the tub, fully clothed kind of bath. A deliberate one. She ran the water warm, lit a candle, lavender. The scent filled the small bathroom. She lowered herself into the water, felt it rise around her belly. The baby moved, a slow, lazy roll, an elbow or a knee pressing against her skin from the inside. She put her hand on the spot, felt the push, pushed back gently. "We're going to be okay," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she believed it yet, but she said it anyway, because sometimes you have to speak the truth before you can feel it. Sometimes the words come first and the belief follows, like footsteps in the dark. 2 days later, the forensic accountant Warren had hired delivered his findings. The shell company wasn't just hiding income, it was hiding a property, a penthouse condominium in Back Bay. 2 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, purchased 8 months ago, the same month Colette told Grant she was pregnant. Delaney Voss's name was on the lease. Grant had used money from the shell company, money diverted from their joint income, money that was half Colette's, to buy his mistress a penthouse apartment. He had furnished a love nest with his pregnant wife's money. Warren presented the finding with his usual calm. "This is devastating for his case," he said. The timing alone. Purchasing a property for his affair partner, the same month his wife announced her pregnancy. No judge in Massachusetts will overlook this. Colette looked at the property listing. High ceilings, hardwood floors, a balcony overlooking the Charles River. She thought about her own kitchen. The curtains she had sewn herself. The backsplash she had grouted on her hands and knees. The nursery she had painted because Grant said hiring a painter was an unnecessary expense. He had called her curtains her biggest ambition. Then he had used her money to buy another woman a penthouse. She set down the listing, looked at Warren. "When is the hearing?" she asked. 3 weeks, he said. "Good," she said. "I'll be ready." Everything was in motion. The legal machinery was grinding forward. Warren was methodical. Harrison was watchful. Blythe was fierce. Ruthie was steady. And Colette was falling apart. It happened at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, 2 weeks before the hearing. The house was dark and silent. Ruthie was asleep in the guest room. The baby was pressing hard against Colette's ribs, making it impossible to find a comfortable position. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and fought the thoughts she had been holding at bay for weeks. What if I lose? What if the judge doesn't care about the forged signature? What if Grant's connections are stronger than my evidence? What if I end up alone with a baby and nothing? And beneath all of those thoughts, the one she had been avoiding most. What if I'm not enough? She sat up, swung her legs over the side of the bed, Her feet touched the cold hardwood floor. The clock on the nightstand read 3:11. She picked up her phone. Grant's number was still in her contacts, still saved under the heart emoji she had put there on their second date, when everything was new and possible and full of light. Her thumb hovered over his name. One call, she could make one call and make all of this stop. Sign the papers, walk away, let him have the house and the money and the life. She could disappear. Start over somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew her name or her father's name or the name of the man who had gutted her. One call. She opened a text message instead, typed 3 words, "I miss you." She stared at them. The cursor blinked after the period. 3 words on a bright screen in a dark room. She deleted them, typed them again, "I miss you," deleted them, typed, "I miss who I thought you were," deleted that too. The screen went dark. She sat there holding a phone with nothing on it, holding the weight of almost. She didn't send anything. Instead, she called Blythe. At 3:22 in the morning, Blythe answered on the second ring. No grogginess, no irritation, just, "Hey?" "I almost called him," Colette said. A pause. "I know. I almost sent a text. I typed it twice. But you didn't," Blythe said. "No. That's the whole thing, Colette. You didn't." They stayed on the phone for 11 minutes. Blythe didn't lecture, didn't give advice, didn't say, "You deserve better," or "He's not worth it," or any of the things that are true but useless at 3 in the morning. She just stayed on the line, breathing, present. After they hung up, Colette went to the nursery. She didn't turn on the light. The street light outside cast the room in amber. Everything was shadow and gold. The crib, the changing table, the rocking chair in the corner. She sat in the rocking chair, began to rock, slow, steady. The chair creaked softly with each motion. Back and forth, back and forth. The baby settled, the house settled. The world narrowed to the sound of wood on wood and the amber light and the slow rhythm of a woman holding herself together. She rocked until the sun came up. 5 days later, the article appeared. Grant's attorney had leaked to a local society blog. The headline read, "Estranged wife of prominent attorney makes wild claims in bitter divorce." The article painted Grant as a reasonable, successful man victimized by a hormonal, irrational wife who was making unsubstantiated accusations to extort a generous settlement. The article used the word unstable 3 times. Blythe sent the screenshot with a 1-line message. "Don't read it." Colette read it, every word. Of course she did. The way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts. It always still hurts. Then she read the comments. Strangers with strong opinions about a woman they had never met. Gold digger, typical baby trap situation. He probably left because she's crazy. Women like this give all women a bad name. She read every comment, every single one, even the ones that made her hands shake and her throat close, because she needed to know what they were saying. We always do, even when we know it will hurt, especially when we know it will hurt. She set the phone down, looked out the window. The October trees were nearly bare, stripped of everything they had spent all spring and summer growing. They don't know me, she thought. They don't know what he did. They don't know about the forged signature, or the shell company, or the penthouse he bought with my money. They are strangers on the internet, judging a woman they have never met based on a story told by the man who destroyed her. And the truth does not need their approval, Warren responded, within 24 hours. A defamation counterclaim against the blog, a motion to seal the divorce proceedings. The judge granted both within 48 hours. The article came down. but the damage lingered, like smoke after a fire. You could still smell it, even after the flames were out. The hearing date arrived on a Thursday in early November. Colette was 9 months pregnant, due in 11 days. The baby sat low, pressing against her pelvis with the impatient weight of someone ready to arrive. She woke at 5 that morning. Ruthie was already in the kitchen, coffee made, toast on a plate, a glass of orange juice. "Eat," Ruthie said. "All of it." Colette ate. She tasted nothing, but she ate because Ruthie told her to, and because the baby needed it, and because sometimes you fuel the machine even when the machine feels broken. She dressed in a navy blue dress, simple cut. No embellishment. She wore her mother's thin gold chain around her neck. No other jewelry. Ruthie braided her hair, French braid, neat and tight. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Ruthie said, her fingers steady in Colette's hair. Colette closed her eyes, let the words settle. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:45. Warren was already there, briefcase open, documents arranged on the table with the precision of a chess player setting up the board. Harrison sat in the gallery. Third row, aisle seat. He wore a gray suit that made him look like any other older gentleman attending court. Quiet, invisible, just another face. Grant arrived at 8:55, late enough to make an entrance but early enough to avoid a reprimand. Donovan Hale walked beside him, carrying a briefcase that was newer and shinier than Warren's. Grant wore a charcoal suit and a blue tie. His hair was freshly cut. His shoes were polished. He saw Colette and smirked. The smirk said everything. It said, "I'm going to win." It said, "You brought a knife to a gunfight." It said, "You are still the girl with no connections and no money and no power. And this is going to end the way I planned." Judge Raymond Calloway entered at 9 o'clock. 62 years old, gray-haired, reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He had been on the bench for 23 years. He had seen everything. He was not impressed by charcoal suits or polished shoes. Warren presented the evidence. He did not rush. He did not grandstand. He laid out each piece the way a mason lays bricks, one at a time, level, straight, building something that could not be knocked down. First, the forged signature. Warren produced the second mortgage document bearing Colette's name. Then he produced the expert handwriting analysis. 14 points of divergence between the signature on the document and Colette's verified handwriting samples. The expert concluded with reasonable certainty that the signature was not Colette's. Grant shifted in his chair. Second, the shell company. Warren displayed the corporate registration from Delaware, the bank records showing deposits from Grant's law firm income, the trail of transactions that led from the shell company to the Back Bay penthouse. Grant's jaw tightened. Third, the penthouse. Warren presented the property deed, the lease agreement with Delaney Voss's name. The purchase date, 8 months prior, matching precisely with the month Colette announced her pregnancy to Grant. Donovan Hale objected. "Relevance, Your Honor. A married man purchasing property for his mistress using marital assets while his wife is pregnant," Judge Calloway said flatly. "I'll determine relevance, Counselor. Overruled." Fourth, the systematic draining of joint accounts. Bank statements. 18 months of transfers. Methodical, calculated, a slow bleed that left Colette with nothing. Fifth, the video. Warren played Blythe's recording. Grant's voice filled the courtroom, confident, mocking, cruel. "She actually thought I was going to stay with a woman whose biggest ambition was throw pillows." The courtroom was silent when the video ended. Grant stared straight ahead. His face had gone the color of ash. Donovan Hale objected to each exhibit. Judge Calloway overruled every objection. One by one, like swatting flies, Then Donovan Hale tried his final move. He stood, straightened his tie, cleared his throat with the theatrical gravity of a man who believed he still had a card to play. "Your Honor," he said, "we have serious concerns about the source of Mrs. Mercer's legal representation. She claims to have no independent financial resources, yet she has retained counsel of this caliber." He gestured toward Warren, as if Warren were an exhibit himself. "We request full financial transparency from Mrs. Mercer's side." "Who is funding this?" Warren stood slowly. "Your Honor, we are happy to provide full financial transparency. In fact, we welcome it." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single document, handed it to the bailiff. The bailiff handed it to the judge. Judge Calloway read it. His eyebrows rose, not dramatically, just a fraction, the way they might rise if he had been expecting rain and instead saw lightning. He looked at Colette, then at the document, then at Grant. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said. He removed his reading glasses, set them on the bench. "Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand the full picture of what is happening here." Grant looked up, confused, wary. "Who is her father?" Judge Calloway asked. The courtroom went still. Grant blinked. "Excuse me? Her father. Your wife's father. Do you know who he is?" Grant looked at Colette, at Warren, at Donovan Hale, who had gone very still, back at the judge. "She told me her father was estranged," Grant said. His voice had lost its polish. It sounded thin, uncertain. "She said she had no family money, no connections. She said—" "Her father," Judge Calloway said slowly, each word placed like a stone, "is Harrison Ashford." Silence. Not the polite silence of a courtroom waiting for the next statement. The airless silence of a room where everyone has stopped breathing at the same time. Grant's face drained. The color left his cheeks, his lips, the skin around his eyes. He went white the way paper goes white. Blank, empty. Donovan Hale's pen slipped from his fingers and clattered on the table. Harrison Ashford, Ashford Industries, Forbes 400, buildings and hospitals and university endowments bearing his name across the eastern seaboard. A man whose legal team had argued cases before the Supreme Court. A man whose net worth exceeded Grant's lifetime, earning potential, by a factor that required scientific notation. "That's not possible," Grant whispered. Colette looked at him, across the courtroom, across the distance between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. She looked at the man who had painted the nursery sage green and emptied her bank account and bought his mistress a penthouse and posted champagne toasts while she sat on the kitchen floor. She looked at him and said, "I never lied to you, Grant. You never asked." 6 words, quiet, steady, devastating. The judge called a 10-minute recess. Grant sat at the defendant's table, motionless. Donovan Hale leaned close and whispered furiously. In the gallery, Margot Mercer had gone the color of old milk. Colette walked to the hallway. Harrison was there, leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets. He didn't say anything, didn't say, "I told you so," or "Are you all right?" or "We've got him." He just handed her a bottle of water and stood beside her. She drank the water. Her hands were steady. She noticed that, after everything, after the empty bank account and the divorce papers on the doorstep and the 3 a.m., terrors and the comments from strangers and the video of her husband mocking her to a room full of laughing colleagues, her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. Court resumed at 9:47. The dynamic in the room had shifted. You could feel it in the air, the way you can feel a storm approaching before the first drop falls. The energy had reversed polarity. Grant, who had walked into the courtroom smirking, now sat rigid in his chair, his hands flat on the table, as if to keep them from shaking. Donovan Hale stood. Your Honor, in light of this new information, we respectfully request a continuance to reassess. Denied, Judge Calloway said. He didn't look up from the documents. You've had ample time to prepare. Proceed. Warren rose. This was the final movement. The closing argument built not on rhetoric, but on evidence so overwhelming that rhetoric would have been redundant. Your Honor, Warren said, the facts before the court are as follows. He listed them, one by one, in the calm, measured voice of a man who knew he didn't need to raise it. The prenuptial agreement, which Grant had insisted upon and which Colette had signed in good faith, contained an infidelity clause. Section 12, paragraph 4. Proven infidelity by either party voided the agreement in its entirety. Grant's affair with Delaney Voss was documented, photographed, publicly acknowledged. The prenup was void. The forged signature on the second mortgage constituted criminal fraud. A referral to the district attorney's office had already been submitted. The shell company and its hidden assets constituted contempt of court given that Grant had submitted sworn financial disclosures that failed to mention either the company or the penthouse property. The systematic draining of joint accounts over 18 months constituted financial abuse under Massachusetts domestic relations law. Warren set down his legal pad. In summary, Your Honor, Mr. Mercer has lied to his wife, lied to this court, forged her signature, hidden assets, purchased property for his affair partner using marital funds. And he did all of this while his wife was pregnant, because he believed she had no resources, no family, no one to fight for her. Warren paused. Let the silence gather weight. He was wrong. Grant tried to speak. He half rose from his chair. Your Honor, I can explain. Mr. Mercer. Judge Calloway's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade laid flat. Sit down. Grant sat. I have presided over this bench for 23 years, Judge Calloway said. I have seen contentious divorces, bitter custody disputes, ugly financial disagreements, but I have rarely seen a case where one party has so thoroughly and deliberately attempted to destroy the other. He paused, looked at Grant over the rim of his glasses. You submitted fraudulent financial disclosures to this court. You forged your wife's signature on a mortgage document. You systematically drained marital assets over a period of 18 months. You purchased a luxury property for your affair partner using money that belonged in part to your pregnant wife. And you did all of this, he said, his voice dropping, believing she had no one, no resources, no recourse. Another pause. The clock on the wall ticked, ticked, ticked. You weaponized her isolation. You counted on her helplessness. And when you had taken everything, you celebrated. Grant's head dropped, not in shame, in the recognition of total, irreversible defeat. Judge Calloway issued his ruling. Full custody of the unborn child to Colette Mercer. Exclusive use of the marital home. Significant alimony based on the standard of living established during the marriage. Full restitution of all misappropriated assets. A criminal referral to the district attorney for the forged signature. And the prenuptial agreement, the document Grant had demanded as a condition of marriage, was declared void. Every asset Grant had tried to protect was now subject to equitable distribution. The townhouse, the investment accounts, the shell company, the penthouse, all of it. Colette sat with her hands folded in her lap. She did not cry. She did not smile. She did not look at Grant. She sat perfectly still and let the evidence speak the way Warren had arranged for it to speak. And she was the most powerful person in that room precisely because she said nothing. That was the dignity win. And in the gallery, the colleagues who had laughed when Grant mocked his wife's throw pillows watched in silence as a man's career, reputation, and future disintegrated in real time. That was the truth win. In the hallway after the ruling, Colette was walking toward the elevator when a voice stopped her. "Mrs. Mercer?" She turned. Delaney Voss stood 5 feet away, red-eyed, jaw tight, hands clasped in front of her, as if holding something invisible together. Everyone in the hallway tensed. Blythe stepped closer. Warren's hand moved toward his phone, but Delaney didn't attack. "He told me you were abusive," Delaney said. Her voice was flat, drained. "Controlling. He said you trapped him with the pregnancy. He said the marriage had been over for years, and you refused to let go." A pause. "I believed him." Colette looked at her, really looked. Past the sharp cheekbones and the expensive dress, she saw a 28-year-old woman, pregnant, standing in a courthouse hallway, realizing that the man she had chosen was a lie wrapped in a charcoal suit. "He's very convincing," Colette said. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with something that lived in the complicated space between understanding and exhaustion. Delaney nodded, turned, walked away. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, growing softer with each step until they disappeared. She would have her own reckoning with Grant Mercer. But that was her story, not this one. "I didn't win because I was rich," Colette thought, watching Delaney disappear around the corner. "I won because I was right. The money just made sure someone listened." 3 weeks later, Colette sat in the rocking chair in the nursery and held her daughter for the first time. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, born at 2:27 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. Dark hair, strong lungs. She came into the world screaming as if she had opinions about it already. Colette named her Eloise, after her mother. "Eloise Grace Ashford Mercer," she whispered into the soft crown of her daughter's head. The baby smelled like milk and clean cotton, and something indefinable that Colette would spend the rest of her life associating with this exact moment. Harrison arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after the birth. He had been sitting in the waiting room for 11 hours. Ruthie had tried to get him to go home. He had refused. He stood in the doorway of the hospital room, looking at his daughter, holding his granddaughter. His eyes were red. His hands shook more than usual. "Come in," Colette said. He crossed the room, sat in the chair beside the bed. Colette placed Eloise in his arms, carefully, like handing someone a piece of the sun. Harrison looked down at the baby, his breath caught. For a moment, the billionaire, the chairman, the man who commanded boardrooms and shaped industries, disappeared entirely. In his place was just a grandfather, holding a 7-pound girl who didn't know his name or his net worth or anything about him except that his arms were warm and his heartbeat was steady. "She has your mother's chin," he said. His voice cracked on the word mother. Colette smiled. "She has your stubbornness." She refused to come out for 3 hours after labor started. "That's not stubbornness," Harrison said. "That's strategic timing." They sat in the quiet. The hospital hummed around them. Machines beeped softly in distant rooms. Nurses walked past the doorway with purposeful steps. But inside this room, time slowed, almost stopped. "I missed 6 years," Harrison said, not looking up from the baby. "I missed your wedding, your house, your life. I sat in my office and respected your wishes, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done." "I know," Colette said. "The second hardest thing," he continued, "was sitting in that courtroom and not walking up to Grant Mercer and breaking his jaw." Colette laughed. A real laugh-us. The first one in months. It hurt her stitches. She didn't care. Eloise slept through it. Apparently, she had her mother's ability to sleep through noise when it suited her. The weeks that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air is clean and the ground is wet, and the world looks different because something has been washed away. Grant pleaded guilty to the forgery charge. His attorney negotiated the plea down from a felony to a misdemeanor, but the Massachusetts Bar Association conducted its own investigation. They found additional irregularities in his practice: billing discrepancies, client fund mismanagement, the kind of things that might have gone unnoticed if no one had been looking. Someone was looking now. Grant lost his license to practice law. The firm terminated him immediately. Richard Voss, whose daughter Grant had been using as a career ladder, personally signed the termination letter. Margot stopped returning Grant's calls. She told her book club that Grant was going through a difficult transition and changed the subject whenever his name came up. Delaney left him the week after the hearing. She moved back to her father's house in Wellesley. She did not return his calls either. Blythe told Colette the details. Colette hadn't asked, but Blythe told her anyway, because Blythe believed in the therapeutic value of watching karma work. "He's living in a studio apartment in Quincy," Blythe said, "above a dry cleaner." Colette was nursing Eloise when Blythe told her this. She paused, felt something. Not satisfaction, not pity exactly, just distance. He was a chapter she had finished reading. The pages were still there if she went looking, but the story had moved on. "I hope he figures it out," Colette said. Blythe raised an eyebrow. "You're a better person than me." "No," Colette said. "I just don't have room for anger anymore. She takes up all the room." She looked down at Eloise, who had fallen asleep at the breast, milk-drunk and peaceful. All the room in the world. The months passed. November became December, became January. Snow fell on Boston and covered the garden where Colette had planted flowers last spring. The flowers were gone, but the roots were still there, beneath the frozen earth, waiting. Colette was up at 3 in the morning again, but this time it was because Eloise was hungry, not because the world was ending. She sat in the rocking chair in the sage-green nursery and fed her daughter. The streetlight outside cast the same amber glow it always had. Same light, same room, same rocking chair. But everything was different. She looked around the nursery. The walls Grant had painted, the crib they had assembled, the room he had built as a prop in a performance. And she thought about how strange it was that the most beautiful room in the house had been built by a man who never meant any of it. And yet the room was still beautiful, still warm, still safe. Because beauty doesn't belong to the person who creates it. It belongs to the person who lives in it. She rocked Eloise. Back and forth, the chair creaked softly. The baby's breathing was slow and even. Outside, snow fell in silent curtains. She thought about what she would tell her younger self. The girl who hid her father's name because she wanted to be loved for who she was. The girl who wore department store clothes and drove a used car and never mentioned the business card in her bedside drawer. Was she wrong to do that? She turned the question over like a stone in her hand. No, she wasn't wrong to want that. To want to be loved for herself. To want a man who chose her without knowing what she came with. That want was pure. True, good. But Grant failed the test. And the lesson wasn't that people can't be trusted. The lesson wasn't that love is a trap, or that honesty is naive, or that money is the only real protection. The lesson was simpler than that. The people who love you don't need you to be less than you are. That was it, the whole thing. A man who truly loved her would not have needed her to be smaller, poorer, less connected, less protected. A man who truly loved her would have said, "Your father's a billionaire. That's amazing. Tell me about him." Grant needed her to be less so he could feel like more. And when he found someone who could make him more without him having to pretend, he threw Colette away like a receipt from a store he would never visit again. The prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden, and Grant, with all his cruelty and calculation, had accidentally set her free. 6 months after the hearing, Colette walked into the offices of Ashford Industries for the first time in 7 years. The building was glass and steel, 42 stories, in downtown Manhattan. She had grown up running through these hallways, doing homework in her father's office, eating lunch with the secretaries who slipped her extra cookies. But she wasn't here as Harrison Ashford's daughter. Not exactly. She was here as the newest member of the corporate development team. Colette had earned an MBA from Columbia before she met Grant. She had graduated with honors. She had been recruited by 3 firms, and she had turned them all down because Grant said his career should come first, because Grant said one of them should focus on the home, because Grant said it would be simpler if she stepped back. She had stepped back. For 6 years. Now she was stepping forward. Eloise came with her, in a carrier strapped to Colette's chest. 6 months old and already possessing her grandfather's talent for looking unimpressed by large buildings. Harrison met them at the elevator. He looked at his daughter, in her blazer and heels, his granddaughter asleep against her chest, and he did something Colette had only seen him do 3 times in her entire life. He cried. 1 tear. Just one. He wiped it quickly, cleared his throat, straightened his tie. "Your office is on 37, he said. "Corner. I had them put in extra windows." "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I wanted to." They walked through the building together. Employees nodded. Some stared. Word had gotten around. Harrison Ashford's daughter, the one nobody knew about, the one who had hidden in plain sight for 6 years while her husband systematically tried to destroy her. Colette felt their eyes. She didn't mind. Let them look. Let them see a woman who had been emptied and filled herself back up. Let them see a mother carrying her daughter into a future she had built with her own hands and her own name. Her office was on the 37th floor. Corner, extra windows, the view showed the Manhattan skyline stretching south toward the harbor. The Statue of Liberty was visible on clear days, small and green, and holding her torch. Colette set down her bag, adjusted Eloise in the carrier, sat in her chair, turned on her computer. She had work to do. That evening, after Harrison had held Eloise for an hour and made 3 phone calls, with a baby sleeping on his shoulder, after Ruthie had cooked dinner and Blythe had called to say, "Tell me everything about day 1," after Eloise had her bath and her bottle and her bedtime song, Colette sat alone in the living room of her Boston townhouse. Her townhouse now, fully, legally, irrevocably. She picked up her phone. A notification from her banking app. Her first paycheck had been deposited. Her salary, her money, earned by her mind and her effort and her name. She checked the balance, not 0, not even close. She smiled, closed the app, set the phone on the table. The house was quiet. The nursery monitor glowed green on the shelf, showing the soft rise and fall of Eloise's breathing. Outside, the spring wind moved through the garden, where new shoots were pushing up through soil that had been frozen all winter. Colette leaned back on the couch, closed her eyes. Her balance was no longer 0. It never would be again. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with real lessons and lasting value. Thank you for being part of our community.